Huh, what the heck is this? You know, when you really think about it, video games are such a unique art form because the way we interact with them can be so one of a kind. The stories they tell can be so immersive, and just the ways they try to unpack themselves is just so completely of its own style. But sometimes the people who create video games also like to try and redo certain concepts. Remakes, remasters, reboots. It's basically them going back to the drawing board and taking a second crack at an original idea. What's up, gamers? Dreamcastguy here, and today is Top 10 Thursday. But I want to do something a little bit different, which is normally I'm actually a huge fan of remakes. I love stuff like the new Spyro collection and the Crash Insane trilogy. But for the good, you also get the very, very bad. So today we're going to be diving deep to try and find the top 10 worst gaming remakes. Number 10. Star Wars Battlefront. There's a term I've heard in the past that I think is incredibly useful, which goes, don't trust style over substance. Essentially what this means is, just because a game has great graphics or really cool cutscenes doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually a good game. And I feel like this so perfectly describes the Star Wars Battlefront reboot. This has no single player campaign. It doesn't have a plot. It doesn't have any reason to actually make you care about this universe. It is a multiplayer-only experience, but beyond this, it controls like trash. Just trying to aim your frickin' phasers out here in space is practically impossible, and even if you do happen to get good with the really sloppy aiming, it doesn't actually feel good just to play. I put quite a few hours into the original Star Wars Battlefront games, but by the time this remake came around, I realized that the idea of Star Wars is practically dead when it's owned by EA. Number 9. Double Dragon Neon. When it comes to game development, perhaps one of the biggest challenges is attempting to revisit arcade experiences. The things that initially were meant to just be put in the corner of a room, beat in less than an hour, and just give you some good memories of the ride along the way. That's part of the reason that I've always very much liked the Double Dragon games, because they've been the most successful on consoles, and each one is very, very fun. Either playing by yourself or you're playing with friends, they can still be very, very exciting. Well, with this reboot, it seemed like the idea was to try and go through and just try and do a beat-for-beat, identical rebuild of the original game, except that they managed to screw it all up. The art style is weird, the combos are a little bit mushy, and just trying to actually finish a level seems like such an arduous task. I get so annoyed when I try and play Double Dragon Neon because I can see the potential. I can see that they tried their best and ended up making the very worst Double Dragon. Number 8. Conker Live and Reloaded. I need to begin this entry with a little bit of a confession, which is that, honestly, for a long time, I considered this version of the game to be superior to the original version that came out on the Nintendo 64. Now, I only see that because, just on the surface, it appears to be quite the drastic improvement. It has better graphics, it has things like really smart aiming, it's just something that manages to be different while still sort of basically existing in the roots of the original. The problem is that this is a heavily censored version of the game, and I didn't realize that until the age of the internet. If you get this version over the Nintendo 64 copy, it is basically a completely different story. They had to cut out the poop jokes, they edited a lot of the songs, they essentially tried to replace a lot of what made this game so shockingly funny in the first place. But wait, something else they decided to redo is actually removing a huge chunk of the multiplayer and replacing it with a very standard first-person shooter bunch of bollocks. I am just stunned that they thought that this is something that would just be actually accepted by fans when it absolutely should have been just flat out thrown away. Number 7. Dead Rising Chop to Ya Drop. There was a very strange phenomena that just randomly rose up during the early 2000s, which I like to call the Wii effect. The Nintendo Wii just happened to sell millions and millions of consoles right out of the gate, and so because of this, a lot of people ended up trying to find any way they could to port their games onto the Nintendo Wii, even though it was drastically weaker. I mean, if you remember correctly, the Nintendo Wii essentially had the power of a Gamecube, but a lot of people who were making stuff on the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 were trying to put stuff on it anyways because it was a huge part of the market that just couldn't be ignored. So they decided to throw the huge zombie slashing simulator Dead Rising onto this, and the final product is a little bit odd. I mean, for the most part, the biggest thing is that they had to make it where the game is relatively empty. You're kind of just running around in big boxes that represent the levels instead of the levels themselves. It is such a scaled down port that I have to call it a remake instead of just a different version of the game, because it is just so fundamentally altered that it just completely ruins the joy that the original version once held. Number 6. Syndicate. It seems like whenever you're trying to make a complete reboot of a game, you basically have two paths before you. The one direction you could take is just taking the original ideas of the game and trying them again. Or the other direction is to try and just keep the spirit alive, but do something completely different. Now, there's a good chance you've never tried Syndicate way back in the day. It was like an isometric shooter that was actually very, very tough and very, very smart. But when it came to this game, it's a little bit boring. And I genuinely feel bad saying that. This is just a very standard, very blasé first-person shooter that sort of just takes some interesting elements like slowing down time and trying to defeat enemies with mind control and stuff, but it never goes anywhere with it. It takes one of the most unique and difficult early shooters and turns it into a very modern muckfest. And I feel really bad that it just seemed like it was trying so hard and got absolutely nowhere. Number 5. Dungeon Keeper. There is nothing in current gaming that makes me more just downright aggravated than when we see a really cool franchise get morphed and reworked into a crappy cell phone game, but that is exactly what they did with Dungeon Keeper. Now, in case it managed to slip your mind, at first, this was a series that was just so goofy and self-aware. It really managed to just kind of put you in the feet of the bad guys and still just make it silly and fun. It was something that just sort of celebrated the weirdness of games. And it was just so great. So what did they do with the cell phone game? Well, they decided to take this idea and shove it into a timer-based app. And yes, I mean, that's really all this is you drop some stuff and you have to spend real money to build more stuff. So it's one of those things where not only is it pay to win, it is an abusive freaking microtransaction hole that they want to take all your love and all your support and throw it down into. And for that, it just eternally earns my ire. Number 4. Alone in the Dark. Okay, so before you get a chance to rush down to the comments and start trying to correct me as to whether or not this is a reboot or a remake, just keep in mind that the Alone in the Dark series is a little bit peculiar. They've actually done a few remakes, but I actually think the other ones are super, super good. Stuff like Alone in the Dark: A New Nightmare back on Dreamcast is super, super spooky. But this game, it sort of seems like it doesn't understand what it's trying to be. It's like got puzzle elements. It's got weird crafting where you're just literally sitting down and shoving different ingredients together to craft different weapons. It's just trying to do so much stuff, and none of it, in my opinion, works at all. Trying to take the action of this game from haunted mansions that used to be out in the woods or off on derelict islands and just shoving it in the middle of New York was a terrible decision that pretty much liquidates any sense of scares this game had. Number 3. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD. There are a few projects on this list that are pretty clearly worse than this one is, but I just want to stop for a second and say that of all the games we're discussing today, this one is the one I despise the most. I flat out hate Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD. If I could delete it off of every single console ever, and even delete the memories from my own head, I would absolutely do it. You know what I did? I saved up a bunch of money, my own lunch money, to purchase this on the Xbox 360 because the description of it is that this is a full remake of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2 combined together. It has garbage physics. You are constantly floating all over the place. The way you're trying to just pull off tricks is so squishy and unimportant. This is basically taking everything that made this series so freaking fun and so addictive and splattering it against the wall for a paycheck. You know the worst part? This game somehow sold enough copies that this actually is the studio that went on to make the completely abysmal Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 5. Yeah, do you remember that freaking dumpster fire? This is why it exists. This is what is wrong with gaming. Number 2. Silent Hill Shattered Memories. You know that you managed to massively mess up if a majority of gamers don't even know that your project exists. I mean, I want you to give me a serious answer. Did you know that somebody made a full remake of the original Silent Hill? Well, this is it. This is a real project. It's sort of a reimagining where instead of just playing a typical survival horror game as Harry Mason, this time around it's more of a centered on the idea of trying to continually get yourself out of impossible situations. It'll basically like lock you in a hotel or trap you in a car parking lot, and you have to try and solve a series of very, very convoluted riddles and puzzles to escape. And then typically there's like a short running part where you have to flee a bunch of different monsters as they chase you. There's no combat, there's no real direct confrontations, but it's supposed to be at its core a different version of Silent Hill 1. And it's one of those things that is just disappointing. I don't want to say that it's garbage. I don't want to say that it's something that just completely destroys the love of the first game, but it's something that just seems like it should have been so much better. Why not give us a good remake that really just manages to instill the original terror in an all-new form? Give us a fresh fright in an old universe, instead of something like this, which feels like just a bad idea that was sort of just shoved out. Number 1. TMNT Reshelled. If you were somebody who decided to walk into any random gaming convention in the world and just start asking people what some of the best multiplayer Super Nintendo games were, there's a good chance that you're going to hear the term Turtles in Time a lot. This was actually just something that was envisioned as a very simplistic beat-em-up, but managed to really transcend itself to basically legendary status. Almost everybody who had an SNES probably played this game, beat this game, or at least loved this game and wanted to grab it. So when we heard news that they were going to be doing a full remake of it, it was pretty hard not to be hyped, except for the fact that they managed to completely ruin it. The music is bad, the new art is weird, everything looks too well lit up, but first and foremost, the biggest issue is that it's just not fun to play. They seriously managed to somehow take one of the greatest freaking games of the 16-bit era and turn it into a paltry cash grab. I cannot believe they made this. And the funny part is that the developers were clearly so ashamed that later on they ended up removing it from stores as some sort of way of basically being like, alright, we realized our mistake, time to delete the past. Well, that's why I'm giving this my pick as the number 1 most awful gaming remake. Did your most hated game not make the list? Got an idea for a future top 10? Leave it in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share with your friends, and subscribe if you haven't already. But do me the biggest favor of all and keep dreaming. And I want to thank a buddy of mine, Tib. Tib actually gave me this really weird controller because I like to try and collect controllers. I had no idea that they had some weird mech controller for the original PlayStation, but you know what? I'm going to use this to play Final Fantasy VII. Thanks so much for watching that video. If you want to see something else, you can always click this link to see what I put up last, or, subscribe and see what's coming up next. Also, I promise that whatever I do, it'll try not to suck.